Hey guys and girls! As you know, we are starting a new chapter and it's on fractions, and the first lesson is on adding and subtracting fractions. So we're going to do a little bit of a review just to kind of get ourselves back, reminding ourselves what fractions are and especially what equivalent fractions are, because we're going to need them for this particular lesson. So a fraction, as we know, is a part of a whole. So for example, a whole pizza would be equal to one whole, but if we had half of the pizza, we would be eating this equivalent. Okay, now if I had a pizza and I ate half, we could say that this is equal to 1/2, right? But just suppose I cut the pizza in half again. So now I have 4 parts in total. So when we're doing fractions, whatever the object or food or whatever it is, the amount of parts that it's divided into is always the bottom number. So right now, in this case, I've divided it into 4 pieces, and then how many pieces are shaded in, or how many pieces have I eaten, right? I've eaten 2. So we could say that 1/2 is equal to 2/4 because I didn't change anything about the pizza. I didn't make it bigger or smaller. I just cut it in half again. So I made the pieces smaller, but in essence, I've still eaten the same amount of pizza. So we could say 1/2 and 2/4 are equal or equivalent. If I were to cut the pizza again, now I would have a total of 6 parts. So again, the bottom number is 6, and then the amount that I've shaded in, or the amount of pizza I've eaten, would now be 3 slices. But again, I didn't change the amount that I ate. So 1/2 is equal to 2/4, 4 is equal to 3/6. So those are all equivalent fractions. So when we're doing adding or subtracting, we can add and subtract fractions. Oops, sorry, that meant to be a 6. We can add and subtract fractions just fine if the denominator if they're the same. So I have 6 here and 6 here. That makes my life super easy, which means when I'm adding, I only add the top numbers. So I go 3 plus 1, that equals 4, and I keep the bottom number the same. Same with subtracting. 3/6 minus 1/6. You just minus the top numbers. 3 minus 1 is 2. Keep the bottom numbers the same, right? You guys have been learning that for years. That's nothing new. And so, you know, it makes adding and subtracting very easy when the denominators are the same. However, what do we do when the denominators are different? Right? So when the denominators are different, we have to make sure that we change them to the same number. So what we do first is we find common multiples. And if you remember, we did that way back at the beginning of the year. So common multiples of 3 would be 3, 6, 9, 12, etc. Multiples of 6 would be 6, 12, 18, etc. So you have to find a common one. So it's easiest if you work with the lowest common denominator. So if we look at the 2 lists here, we see that 12 are common multiples, and so we're going to use that as a common denominator because there isn't anything smaller than that. You can't use 3 because 3 is not a multiple of 6. So again, we take each fraction, 3/6, and we turn it into something over 12 because we've decided that 12 is going to be my new denominator. So if you remember from the beginning of the year doing, we did this type of thing. We say, what do we do to 6 to get to 12? Well, we multiply by 2. And whenever we do to the bottom, we do to the top. So we go 3 times 2. 3 times 2 is 6. So now my new fraction for 3/6 is 6/12, right? So that's that one. And now we'll do 2/3 and change that. 2/3. Using 12 as a denominator. What do I do to 3 to get to 12? I multiply by 4. Whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. 2 times 4 is 8. And so now my new fraction for 2/3 is 8/12. So now I have 6/12 plus 8/12. And because they're common denominators, all I have to do is add the top two numbers. 8 plus 6 is 14. And now we have 14 over 12. Now the other thing that I wanted to go over is because I have 14 over 12, this is called an improper fraction. And the reason why we call it improper is because the top number, the numerator, is bigger than the denominator, which means, we should probably change this back to a mixed number. And a mixed number is when you have a combination of whole numbers and a fraction. So for example, 2 and 1/2, right? We have 2 wholes plus a half. So how to change 14/12 into an improper fraction is you go, how many times does 12 go into 14? It goes in once. What's left over? Well, 2, because 12 going into 14 once is 12. And there's 2 left over, and we keep the denominator the same. So that's how we change an improper fraction to a mixed number. So now my total answer is 1 and 2/12. Let's do another example. Let's go 3/7 minus 1/4. Because adding and subtracting is the same thing. You still need to find a common denominator. So you still need to change each of these numbers. We have to find a common denominator. We have to find what's common between 7 and 4. So if we were to list the common multiples, and the multiple's 4, etc., etc., we'd eventually get to 28. We're going to use 28 as our common denominator here. So then we change each fraction into something over 28. And we go, how many times does 7 go into 28? Well, it goes in 4 times. Whatever we do to the bottom, we do to the top. 3 times 4 is 12. My new fraction for 3/7 is 12 over 28. And then we take the second fraction, which is 1/4, change that into something over 28. How many times does 4 go into 28? Goes in 7 times. 4 times 7 is 28. Whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. And that's my new fraction for 1/4. So now I have 12 28ths and 7. So because we have a common denominator, all we have to do is subtract the numerators. So you go 12 minus 7, which is 5, and the denominator stays the same. Whenever you're finding a final answer, you always want to say, is this the lowest, is this in lowest terms? So for example, if I had 7/28 as an answer, I could reduce this to make it smaller. So I'd be finding smaller equivalent fractions here. I would be saying, okay, what goes into 7 that also goes into 28? Well, it's 7. So all I have to do is divide each of these by the same number, and if it's a whole number, then I found my reduced fraction, right? So 7 divided by 1 is 1, 28 divided by 7 is 4. So my fraction here, 7/28, in lowest terms would be 1/4. Now our actual answer is 5/28. And there's nothing that can go into 5 that can also go into 28, because if we remember our divisibility rules, whatever can be divided by 5 has to end in a 0 or 5, and 28 ends in an 8. So we know that's already in lowest terms. Let's do one more example. Again, we can't add this properly now because our denominators are not the same. So we have to find common denominators. And in this particular case, the lowest common denominator is 60. So again, if you did all the multiples, and then you continue to list them, you would see that the lowest common multiple would be 60 between the two numbers. And sometimes if you just multiply the denominators together, you'll get the lowest common denominator. You'll definitely get a common denominator. Whether it's the lowest one, that's what you have to determine through knowing your multiples and your facts. So now we have 2/5. We have to make it to something over 60. And we go 5 times 12 is 60. Whatever you do to the bottom, you do to the top. So my new fraction is 24/60. And then next one, you go 5/12 equals something over 60. 12 times 5 would give you 60. Whatever you do to the bottom, you do to the top. 5 times 5 is 25. So my other new fraction that I have is 25/60. So now I have 24/60 plus 25/60, and that's going to equal 49/60. And then we have to ask ourselves, is there anything that we can divide into 49 that we can also divide into 60? And we would reduce that into those terms if there was. So hopefully that sheds a little more light on adding and subtracting. The video is going to be added to this, so look for that in my post. And again, watch the video a couple times if there's things that you need to review, but those are the two things that we're going to be exploring tomorrow. Have a good night, guys. See you tomorrow.